Factor 5 was a developer that found success in the early 2000s through their partnership with LucasArts. While their original studio in Cologne, Germany rose to prominence through the creation of its own property, Turrican, the company later found a less risky and more profitable way to produce games in their use of the Star Wars license. After their operations moved over to California in 1996, the Star Wars Rogue Squadron series was born, and their partnership with LucasArts started to bear fruit. After the last Rogue Squadron game in 2003, they continued to seek out other opportunities to use pre-established IPs for future projects. Between late 2003 and well into 2004, the studio went through a string of unsuccessful attempts to kickstart new games using this approach. The studio's relationship with LucasArts took a slight step backwards when what was supposed to be their next big project, an Xbox collection of the Rogue Squadron series, was canned by their new president, Jim Ward. For Factor 5, this was obviously unfortunate, but they had no shortage of offers from other publishers that could help them recover. The two biggest of these were Nintendo and Sony. This was because both of them were now gearing up to get games into development for their next home consoles, the Nintendo Revolution and PlayStation 3 respectively. By this point, the developers had spent several years working with Star Wars, so they decided it would be creatively beneficial to try something new and go after a different property for a change. As Factor 5 often did, they wanted their next game to take advantage of the experience they had gained from doing Rogue Squadron, ergo it would need to have flight combat at its heart. The team arrived at the conclusion that a natural evolution upon the formula, which would also inject some variety into their portfolio, would be a title centered around dragons. They wanted a flight combat game in which the dragons were ridden by humans in order to make the action and the narrative more relatable to players. It was at this juncture that Factor 5 realized that the Dungeons & Dragons license could be a good fit for what they had in mind. In particular, they wanted to use the universe of Dragonlance. The rich mythos of Dragonlance, which was created originally by Laura and Tracy Hickman, tells of a world dominated by dragons. It was first established in the mid-1980s through a series of Dungeons & Dragons branded novels. Factor 5 was hoping to make a game entrenched in the Dragonlance lore, and met with the rights holders to see if it would be possible. The license holders, Wizards of the Coast, were open to the idea on the condition that they would pay a large fee to use the property. It was now up to Factor 5 to sell publishers on the idea. The two that had been anxiously awaiting their next project, Sony and Nintendo, were each given the chance to fund the game. The developers offered them it as a potential exclusive for their next platforms, having enjoyed the benefits of focusing solely on GameCube with the Star Wars titles. However, both Nintendo and Sony declined the offer. Each of them were interested in both the project and the company behind it, but the cost of the license was seen as being far too expensive. With no other publishers willing to cover the costs, their next-gen Dragonlance flight game didn't come to pass. It would never move beyond the earliest of pitch documents. This didn't cause the developers to let go of their idea of doing a dragon-centric game entirely though. It was with some slight reluctance that they chose to make it into a new IP, becoming Lair. Again, both Sony and Nintendo found themselves competing to secure it for their new consoles. There were a few different elements factoring into them deciding which to go with, chief among which were tech specs. Factor 5 quite simply wanted to work with the most powerful console they could, the one in which they saw the most potential for breaking new ground from a technical perspective. Fortunately for them, they were so close with the two industry giants that they were granted intimate access to the details of early prototypes for their new systems. According to Julian Egbrecht, Factor 5 Inc.'s former president, the earlier specifications of Nintendo's Revolution were comparable to that of an Xbox 360. However, Sony in his eyes was outdoing them from a technological standpoint with the PS3's cell processor. Nintendo began to change direction with the Revolution around this time, doubling down on their new controller as its core selling point and opting for less powerful hardware to cut costs. The people of Factor 5 who had previously pushed for Nintendo doing a more powerful console with the GameCube were left somewhat baffled by the decision. This led them towards finally choosing Sony as their new partner. Another big motivation for them doing this was that Sony offered them an enticing multi-game contract. The developers had begun wanting to explore more original ideas, and the deal would allow them to do just that. In addition to Lair, they were signing on to produce a few other new IPs for Sony systems, including 2 digital projects for PSN. None of these were ever finished. An ex-employee of Factor 5 informed me that their general concept for the Dragonlance game, described in its pitch, was largely identical to what Lair would become, minus Lair's heavy reliance upon motion controls. Another former worker shared that it was essentially the same game without the convoluted narrative of Lair. In its early days, Lair flirted with a few more of the fantasy tropes seen in the Dragonlance universe than the final game itself did, hinted, such as the presence of gods overlooking the world. One idea they had depicted a being known as the Mother God. This would have been an omnipotent creature that the player could visit and interact with, which would have altered its appearance and personality based upon happenings in the world. She had two forms, one benevolent and merciful, the other a violent bringer of death. This concept was ultimately abandoned in pre-production. Lair would remain a Sony console exclusive as per their agreement, although the engine which powered it was eventually ported to the Wii. Factor 5 used this to develop all of their games for the system, but none of them would ever be released. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe for many more exclusive looks at lost games just like this one. You can hit the annotations to discover some previously unseen, unreleased Star Wars games, or my video on 6 various game projects that were abandoned. I've been Liam, I hope this video has been of interest, and have fun.